All right, good morning. Everyone's surviving the heat. It was so hot yesterday. It was awful. Though I just read, like literally just a minute ago, that we have like an unseasonable cool front coming through. So it'll only be 80 on Saturday instead of 100. Unseasonably cold. I was like, oh, rain. It's gonna be so nice. 80. Wait a minute. Right. I guess 80 is better than 100. I'll take it. 100 degrees and practicing softball is not very fun. So 80 sounds much better, right? But Wednesday, it's almost the weekend. We're getting there, halfway through the week. And we're gonna start chapter 2 today. Any lingering thoughts, questions, anything from last time before we kind of jump into a new topic today, just to check? Okay. So what we'll look at in chapter 2 are some of like the big sex researchers and what does it look like to do sex research? And I hope that you thought a little bit about what you would want to know. If you're like, oh shoot, I forgot, be thinking about it in the back of your mind, because kind of toward the end today, that's gonna start to come up. But if you were to research anything related to sexuality, what would you want to know? So be thinking about that if you didn't already. But we'll look a little bit at some big sex researchers, mainly focusing on like Kinsey and a couple of others who have a really big role in the field. And then how we do research and some problems and issues with research. And kind of an interesting picture here, just like as a side note, this researcher, right, we got the birds and the bees, right? The birds and the bees, right, kind of a metaphor that we often use for talking about sexuality, right? So bees carry and deposit pollen into flowers, which is a visible, kind of easy to use example of male fertilization. And then birds lay eggs, similar to like how women like produce and like ovulate, right? Kind of a comparison to make with women. So if you ever wonder where that birds and the bees idea comes from, usually synonymous to that talk about sex. Something that I need to do with my 3 girls, but I've been putting off, right? My 12-year-olds are like, oh, I know all about it. Really? I'm curious. Do tell, right? We'll find out. They have TikTok, and so they think they know everything about everything right now. It's cute. So something I've been needing to do with my kids that I probably should get on that, but soon. I'm putting it off. I'm in denial, right? That they're getting older on me. But anyway, we'll talk about some of kind of these theories and these researchers. And as I mentioned, there will often be things that I don't cover everything from. And here's that kind of our first big one. And I'll talk about that in a second. Well, we look at a lot of theories, and this was the topic in my abnormal psych class earlier today too. Like theories are a big part of psychology, right? And if you've taken a bunch of intro level classes, you've probably covered the different theories in every single one of them, right? It's a really big part of like early psychology stuff. But a theory is a set of assumptions or principles or methods that helps us to understand something. In our case, sexuality, right? Human sexuality. We have theories to help us understand like what contributes to our sexuality, how do we approach it, like, and so on, how do we study it? They provide like an intellectual structure or a framework or a lens as a way to view something. And there are quite a few theories of sexuality, right? And your book does a beautiful job of covering them. I'm not going to go into them. I want to focus on some other things, but I believe the theories start on page 28. So make sure that you kind of read through them on your own. I might ask you questions about them on that first exam, but there's a lot of different ways to view what has contributed to our sexuality as it is now, right? Whether it's like very Freudian or very behavioral or very cognitive. So make sure you kind of look over and read through those. What I want to focus on a little bit more is kind of the research side of it. And so that's what we'll look at most in this chapter. But again, they start on like page 28 or so in the textbook. What we're going to think more about is kind of how do we study and know what we know about sexuality. And someone who studies sexuality professionally is called a sexologist, right? That's the kind of the technical name, or sex researcher. Things to be when you grow up, right? What do you want to be when you grow up? Sexologist, right? Sex researcher, someone who studies it. And we still have so much that we don't know. This is a very like problem-driven, fragmented, taboo area of study, still, even now. Right? And if we go back as long as we have like recorded history of people studying sexuality, it started out like in the 19th century, so the 1800s, as focusing only on like the bizarre and the dangerous and unhealthy aspects of sex. Not what was normal or typical or good, but very like bizarre, dangerous, and unhealthy. And it was largely something that was done by physicians, doctors, right? Not people who study the psychology side of it, but more like how does your body respond and what are the biological things going on in your body when you're aroused or engaging in sexuality. And as I mentioned, very like problem-driven and fragmented, and also very heavily influenced by the events of the times. A lot of the early people studying sex found themselves without jobs, found themselves shunned in their communities, their buildings and homes burned because they were deemed to be doing something filthy, disgusting, and so on. Very like heavily influenced by the times. And as we kind of talked about in chapter 1, right, like things have changed quite a bit over time, and this is much more accepted now, but there's still a lot of need for research on sexuality. Quite a few people have kind of contributed over time to studying sexuality. These are some of the smaller contributors, and then the next slide are more the people I want you to know about. So just kind of introducing these folks. Sigmund Freud, and I talked about him in my other class today as well, right? A big name in psychology. He was famous for the idea of the libido, our sexual energy. And he talked a lot about how the libido could focus on different parts of the body as we get older. A lot of like early childhood sexuality stuff that makes people really uncomfortable, thinking about being attracted to or in love with your mother and hating your father, the Oedipal and Electra complex that he's so well known for. But he was one of the big early contributors to like psychology and sexuality. Then a lot of other like, again, kind of smaller folks, but the people who do have a role. Ewan Block was the first one to make a journal about sexuality. So he made the Journal of Sexology, very, very controversial, was burned quite a bit when it came out. Magnus Hirschfeld founded the first Institute for Sexology. Again, I won't ask you about these people, but just kind of sharing briefly what they contributed. Richard von Krafft-Ebing wrote a book called Psychopathia Sexualis. Has a very like intriguing looking cover. Sadly, a very dry, boring book. You wouldn't think so from the title and the cover. But it was very medical in nature, looking at 200 case studies of people showing abnormal sexual behavior from a very like medical model perspective. Havelock Ellis wrote the Studies in the Psychology of Sex, very dry and boring. So he just kind of like faded away and wasn't overly famous. Clelia Mosher, another one, one of the first women, played a role looking at differences between male and female sexuality. All of these folks, again, kind of having some smaller contributions and really struggling with the events and politics of the time. As I mentioned, a lot of them found themselves without jobs or viewed very negatively or controversially in their communities. The ones that we're more kind of interested in, and some of the more, like, we'll say profound or like involved people, Kinsey, Masters and Johnson, and then Evelyn Hooker. Could you ask for a better like sex researcher name than that? Maybe, very inappropriate there. But Kinsey, Masters and Johnson, those two were very big in the field, especially Kinsey. Kinsey was probably the most influential sex researcher of the 20th century. Right? He was one of the first people to really study sexuality, to study it on a broad scale and write books about like male and female sexuality and kind of put it out there into the world. A lot of issues with his research. It was very like statistically and like research flawed in a sense. He had a lot of problems with his samples, and he took samples of his students, which are samples of convenience and not the most reliable. But he by far is the most like influential sex researcher to date. Masters and Johnson were a couple that were married, right? And who looked quite a bit at anatomy and physiology. They recruited hundreds of couples and brought them in and recorded them having sex. Video recorded them and monitored them with all sorts of different instruments to gauge like muscle response and blood flow and orgasm. They are the ones who are credited for talking about our sexual response cycle. How do we respond when we're aroused or engaging in any kind of sexuality? And that brings up kind of one of the issues that we'll talk about later, right? Like a sample of convenience. Imagine it volunteering for that. As you think about sex research, like what would you be comfortable volunteering for? Would you be willing to have someone record you and your partner having sex and watch you while you have instruments hooked up all over you? Would you be willing to answer a questionnaire or do an interview? These are all issues that come up when we're talking about different levels of sex research, something we'll talk a little bit more about later. And then Evelyn Hooker was the first one to challenge the view that homosexuality was a mental illness. All the way up until 1973, you could be diagnosed with a mental disorder if you identified as homosexual, and then it required treatment, and it was removed as a disorder because of her research. Now, as I think I mentioned last time, I have a documentary about Kinsey. Now, it's a long documentary. I'm only going to show you the first like 20-something minutes of it, but I think it's really interesting. It gives you a background on him. He wasn't a sexologist. He wasn't even a psychologist. He just became interested in sexuality, was the first person to teach a class about it, right? And it was so different. You had to be married to take his human sexuality class. Like people pretended to be married. They got fake wedding rings. They moved up their wedding dates so that they could be in his class. Such a different time. People fainted when he put stuff up on the screen. I mean, just wildly different from today. I imagine nobody got married on purpose to take this class. But like it was such a requirement at the time. And so I want to show you this documentary. You don't need to take notes on it or anything, but just pay attention. I'm only going to show you, as I said, about like 20-something minutes of it, just to give you a little background on him and what he did. Very different time, right? And I think that's kind of interesting to note as well. So I'll hit the lights, but stay with me. And again, you don't have to take notes, just pay attention. Pause this.
Program deals with the study of sexual behavior and includes.
I love the like historical context of it. Like just the fact that it was like the whole campus was talking about this sexuality class and people were getting married for it and all of that is so wild to consider when it's such an accessible thing now. And can you imagine borrowing my car to go have sex with it and then bring it, or in it, not with it, in it, in it, and then bring it back to me? Like how odd, like what a like cool thing. But what was that? I hopefully often, right? Or hopefully people did that after, I don't know, but like just such a different period of time, right? And they showed a little bit of his research, the second half of this documentary, which is really interesting. It's just called Kinsey. It was on like PBS years ago. The second part of it shows a little bit more about his research, but he used his students as his research subjects, which is okay, but it's not the best, right? It's considered what's called a sample of convenience. And he had really poor sampling issues with his research. And it led to a lot of problems with like the conclusions that he made, but he was the first one to teach a class in this nation on human sexuality. He was the first one to publish books about it and really like start a conversation about sex. So he tends to have, again, that like very important role. And I just love like how far we've come, right? When your two little pinkies touch, that's sex. Like, no, it's a nice thought, but no, right? Or like I masturbated and I thought I invented it, right? Just again, the ideas that have really just grown and developed over time. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of issues with what he did, and it'll kind of lead us into some of the issues with sexuality. When you're studying anything, when you're doing any kind of research, there are a lot of things that you have to consider. And sexuality being a very like sensitive topic, there might be even more so here. But you have to have what's called informed consent. And this is an issue with the fact that the people he studied were his students, right? Informed consent means that you can agree to participate freely. You know what you're getting into. You've been informed and you give your consent or willingness to participate. His students might have felt like they had no choice but to participate, right? Because they were in his class. And that could be a potential sampling issue. It also leads to issues with confidentiality. But whenever you gather information, it has to be kept private. Now, you can obviously share like trends, but you can't say this person said this, and I'm going to publish that and reveal all that information. And it might be difficult to keep confidentiality when they're your students, right? And you might like recognize them or some of the things that they said or shared with you. Another really big issue has to do with a volunteer bias, right? Again, I asked you this earlier. Think about, do you think there might be any kind of like slanting of the data for people who are willing to volunteer to be recorded having sex with each other? Right? Like not everyone would be willing to do that. I won't ask you to admit it, but I wouldn't be willing to do that. And I'm pretty like liberal with sexuality. I wouldn't be like, all right, go ahead, let's film it, and like write it down and have everyone watch, right? Nothing, right? That would make me incredibly uncomfortable. So somebody who's willing to volunteer for that, is that like the typical normal response in person? Maybe, right? But there's a lot of issues with like, who's willing to volunteer? And the people who volunteer may be kind of skewing the data, especially if you're only using your students, which is a sample of convenience, right? Maybe all of you wouldn't be an accurate reflection of society, right? Most of you are like within a certain age range. It might not reflect everyone, right? Or educated versus people who maybe aren't educated, right? So you have to get a really good variety when you're taking a sample if you want to be able to make conclusions. And that's probably the biggest criticism of his work, is that he didn't get a good sample. His sample wasn't overly representative of the community at large. You also run into a lot of issues with doing this kind of research where people lie, right? People are uncomfortable talking about their sexuality, so maybe they don't tell you the truth, or maybe they don't know the truth. Maybe if you ask them how many times they had sex and they think sex is 2 fingers touching, right? Like, is that information accurate? Right. And so there's a lot of issues with validity or accuracy when it comes to sex research, and then reliability or consistency, right? Kind of getting consistent, reliable answers from people. So of all of the areas of research, this one tends to be tricky, especially with some of the validity stuff, right? And if you ask someone, what is your gender identity? And they don't know what that means, is that information accurate, right? And so it's something that he ran into a lot, and we run into a lot even now. And I think one of the best ways to see some of these issues is to let you explore them. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do like an activity that will start today, but it'll take up most of our time on Monday. I'm going to have you be sex researchers. I've done this for years. It's always gone okay. Right? I'm always waiting for the year where it's not, but like, you know, hopefully that's not this year, knock on something. What I'm going to have you do, so here's part 1. I want you to get into groups of like 3 to 5 people. I know I wrote 3 to 4, but like 3 to 5. I don't want it to be much smaller. If it's too much pressure on you, or much bigger, because then it gets overwhelmed. So like 3, 4, or 5 people ideally. And as a group, I want you to start brainstorming, which is why I had you think about it. If you could study anything related to sexuality, what would you want to know? Now, I want you to try and keep this grounded, because you're going to be going out on campus on Monday, asking other people these questions. So don't be like, I want to know how many times somebody orgasms and I'm going to measure them doing it right now. You can ask how many times people orgasm. Well, we don't have access to the other half, sadly, right? As interesting as that would be. So what I want you to do as a group is pull out a piece of paper and have somebody write this down, somebody in your group. What are some questions that you would want to know, right? Come up with a couple, right? Or maybe it's like one topic. Let's say you want to know about masturbation, and then what are a couple of questions that you want to know about? What are some demographics that you would want to gather from people? Like, do you want to know if they're single or in a relationship or married? Do you want to know their orientation or their gender? Do you want to know their religious background? Like, what do you want to know that might affect the things that you're asking? And then how are you going to ask these questions, right? I want you to kind of start coming up with specific questions. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time and then I'm going to stop and check in with you and then I'll give you a little more time. But find like 3 to 5 people and start narrowing it down to like a topic and a couple of questions that you are willing and comfortable to go out and ask on Monday. Right? Please don't like, I see some of you have that look like I'm not coming over, right? Like, we'll talk about like, not everybody has to ask questions. We can break it up however you're comfortable. But let's start getting some ideas. Okay, so find a few people, get a piece of paper, start jotting this down. I'm gonna be wandering around to help. And then I'll stop you in like 10 minutes or so just to check in. Yeah.
Yes.
That's in my.
Nice.
No, I would like to have like in their head.
They're not allowed to spread that around their guidelines. Wild thing taken out of court.
I have to be for like give me 3 to 5. Yeah, like what's the biggest thing? Yeah, right. Yeah. I don't.
You guys did about logistics of things and that still like about
yeah, and like yeah, it's like I just made but it like yeah, right, I just want to know, like, but I want to know what color is it, right?
All around.
Like, oh, okay, like, yes, I got that. You know, like,
yes. I was expecting of one then
It's basically I feel like you have to be like.
Yeah, I mean, it's real weird, but like, in a
You know, or like a play or what.
It's gonna be hard, because this is a very.
Honestly, I can say I'm a
Yeah. So like,
one person. Big data and help write it report. I know. That way, you know. Yeah, it's like that. That way it's not just for them. What if my impact? Yeah, that's like other as they would not disclose. And then yeah. What do you want to know? So what, so we need to know. So we're asking like how do you what they're like.
Are you comfortable with like? Yeah. Yeah.
Like you could even run. Right, so that.
That would be her question, right? Instead of like.
I mean,
how-
they didn't really address it.
That can be like a class, how do you sound?
Maybe-
So that way, if somebody is like. And it's still like. Given that, right? So like, if somebody is like, and we say sensory, so that would have been married. I just want to if they give that. We have to clarify, and if we have to, like, if they have. Question we're asking. And like, they say, yeah, I think that's it.
No, I really tried.
No, you got rid of it.
You definitely know.
So we actually.
It doesn't really matter. It's really too much money. So,
Yeah, that's their orientation.
And you're.
Section one.
And I was like, or they be more comfortable and it's like, they know. Right. We wouldn't know. Like that's. I don't know. So we want to basically know, basically want to know men and women, how they.
I feel like
their casual that men undervalue, that I've heard some people that overvalue it, or how it is, and like different. Right, like it's different. Might be great.
It's like.
Yeah, I wrote that for. I thought, keeping track of people, like, how many.
I don't think I know. Yeah. That was one of All right, can I get your? You know, I did that for my.
I have to say, I'm excited, but then this excited me. Yeah, here, I'm excited. I'll give you 4 minutes. I made it around, I think, I'm gonna come back to all of you so talking, but I've made it around to everyone. I think you all have really interesting and doable, acceptable questions. What I want you to focus on for the last, like, maybe like 4 or 5 more minutes, and then I'll take attendance before the end. I want you to focus on just trying to get any questions down, get specifics down. I don't want you doing too much outside of here. Okay, so like I'm gonna give you some time at the beginning next class to meet as a group again. We'll talk about ground rules, we'll talk about what we're gonna do, we'll do a lot of that stuff. And then we'll go out and ask some of these questions. So try and get these questions down, use the last like few minutes, and then I'll stop you in a few minutes to do attendance. Couple more minutes.
We don't go with it, but another question outside. I think it's going to be. Okay. Like A's right? Like.
I don't.